Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are so excited about this summit series. We had a wonderful kickoff last week, and we are incredibly excited about the panels that we have going forward today and Thursday. So before we start, just allow me to introduce myself. My name is Arlene Lemus. I am the CEO of PAVE Prevention, Proactive Anti-Violence Education, and we are the hosts of the PAVE Summit. This is our second year that we've hosted the summit. We were in person last year. We are virtual this year. And the whole idea and the whole premise behind the summit is that we are trying to find out what is working, what is not working. We're trying to share stories and share successes in violence prevention throughout all sectors. Our initial research showed us that, the sectors hit heaviest were the hospitality sector and the healthcare sector, emergency preparedness sector. But as we expand our work, we are seeing more and more that other sectors are influenced as well. And that's what I'd really like to discuss today, is how libraries have shifted into this new role for our communities, and they are more important than ever. So I'd like to share a quote with you, and I shared it on social media today, and I think it's very powerful. It is by the author Josie Brown. I grew up in libraries, and I hope I've learned never to take them for granted. A thriving library is the heart of its community, providing access to information and educational opportunities, bringing people together, leveling the playing field, and archiving our history. So with that, I would like to introduce our two panelists who I am incredibly excited and grateful that they are joining us today. Commissioner Chris Brown and Manager Jean Badalamenti. Welcome. And we're going to go right into conversation. So Jean and Commissioner Brown, Commissioner Chris, share a little bit about how you came to participating in this role as leadership in libraries in your systems, the DC Public Libraries and the Chicago Public Libraries. Jean, could you share with us first?
Sure, and thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this really interesting conference. I've been with the DC Public Library for 10 years. I came here specifically, I was one of the first social workers hired in a public library system. My initial charge was to help the library system think about and so how we could serve people experiencing homelessness who spend the day in our public libraries. That's why I came. That's why I was hired, and we were interested in working with partners around the city to help support people who are homeless and are using our libraries for a variety of reasons, everything from looking at books to doing research to using computers, bathrooms, etc. So that's what brought me to public libraries. My role has changed and shaped itself into all kinds of different things.
Great. Thank you, Jean. Commissioner Brown?
Hey, everybody. So good to be in discussion with you all today about this kind of timely topic of how libraries are getting involved in cultural wars and the different roles we're playing. I've been at Chicago Public Library for almost 3 years, and what brought me here kind of gets back to when I first got into libraries. So I was living in Chicago in my early 20s, and my then wife and I were really kind of falling in love with the city. But we had grown up in California, so we hadn't really ever lived in a city that had so much segregation, like so much racial segregation, so much opportunity segregation. And I think if you're in the library field, you're really committed to access and making sure everyone has opportunity. And so I think it was always in the back of my mind that if I was in an administrative leadership role, Chicago would be one of the places I'd love to be. So I came back from Santa Clara County, which is in Silicon Valley, a very racially diverse community, but not as diverse socioeconomically. So I feel like I'm getting to really get into my deepest values, what drew me to libraries. And I think in Chicago, our libraries are really seen as this neighborhood localized access point. We have a lot of different level of access for broadband, early childhood literacy programming, safe out of school time for youth. And so I think we really serve as that neighborhood connector to resources for every age and learning need within our city. Safety ends up becoming a big part of that, as I'm sure we'll get into.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. Okay, so both of you touched a little bit on my first question for you, and this will be for both of you. And Commissioner Brown, you can start us on this. How have libraries evolved, right? Because it's not the library that I used to enjoy and be a member of. And so if you could share some of the initiatives, you touched on some of them already, that your libraries are involved in, and then what are these new challenges, right? Because I had no idea that librarians were or could be administering Narcan. I had no ideas what libraries had become during COVID. They were vaccine centers, they were test sites, so all of these things, libraries as pillars in our community are taking on. So please, Commissioner Brown, if you could share some of the initiatives of CPL and then the challenges.
Sure. And I think libraries right now are in this unique moment coming out of the pandemic where we really changed our engagement with people. You think about 2 or 3 years of kids not coming in the same way. We're really in this moment of rebuilding audience. And I think Chicago has done a lot to kind of further the dialogue about the role libraries can play. We really, I think, kind of made our mark with these co-located models of service where we have libraries that go into sites with affordable housing. We have examples of them being paired with early childhood development services, child care centers. And so that's one example of how our libraries are sort of rethinking themselves, getting services like broadband, out of school time learning, safe youth development spaces closer to people that have the highest levels of need. And then in Chicago, we're also in this moment of really celebrating our history. We're in the midst of our 150th anniversary. So we're kind of looking back as we look forward and sort of plan for our future innovation.
So Commissioner Brown, on these we'll touch base on a couple of challenges that I want to ask you about. Jean, please share any initiatives or things that our participants should know that libraries are doing different. What are DC libraries doing different we might not know about?
Sure. I mean, I think, the idea that libraries are places where people can go and just get books and maybe use the computer and do some studying is definitely evolved. Libraries have maker spaces where people are coming in and creating things using all sorts of new devices and 3D printers, where you mentioned the DC Public Library was a key place where during COVID, we were giving out test kits, partnering with our Department of Health, providing vaccines in our buildings. You know, the DC Public Library has 26 branches. I manage a library inside of our jail. We're trying to serve that population. So I feel like, as Commissioner Brown pointed out, it's sort of this unending expanse of possibility at the public library. And sometimes it feels like anything that comes our way, we're like, okay, we're going to do it. I mean, you know, I feel like we've become a center for art exhibitions. Our main library is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library. And so there's just a lot happening. And all of that, you know, we're bringing in new people, but all of that's happening while we're also really in the midst of some pretty heavy things happening in our city. And we're also addressing those things, like, you know, the opioid epidemic. And because all of it, you know, the public library is a space where, as I always say, it's the only space where you can come in without having to buy anything, go through a metal detector, show identification. It's the most democratic space outside of a park that you can be in. And so with all the wonderful things happening, new initiatives, there's also, you know, real life that comes through the door.
And I think Jean's, you know, pointing out that kind of social wellness, social service connector role that we're playing in a much more pronounced way. So we have a new partnership with the Department of Public Health, where the neighborhoods of our city where they do not have a bricks and mortar site, they're putting mental health clinicians into those libraries to do one-on-one service support, like men's mental wellness group, groups for youth. Jean mentioned the Narcan access that so many of our libraries do. We're also launching 2 vending units that are for members of our unhoused community. So they're able to get PIN numbers and then access things like hygienic resources, socks, just things that people who are unhoused need on a regular basis. We do feeding for over 36,000 youth through a partnership with Greater Chicago Food Depository. So I think Jean's absolutely right. We're kind of in this moment where our partners or folks who maybe don't have that brick and mortar touch point are looking to us to connect with the greater city. And I think that's where it works well. But it's very emergent. You know, over the last 10 years, we're really figuring out, like, what exactly does that look like? Does that look like social workers? Does that look like Narcan access? And I think every city and municipality is a little bit different in how they're resourced and set up. So it looks a little bit different.
Thank you. Thank you to the both of you on that. So I hope that our participants are really getting this picture that libraries have morphed into everything that their communities need them really at the time. They are stepping up and really fighting for us all in many different ways. Such an incredible part of our and valuable part of our community. So Commissioner Brown, I'm going to take a question to you from a conversation that we had. One of the things that came out of last year's summit is this idea that in order to make real cultural change within an organization, all stakeholders, representation from all stakeholders needs to be at the table when discussing creating safer workplaces and safer communities. And you shared something with me on how you are dealing with the unfortunate bomb threats that Chicago Public Libraries quite often get. So could you share with us today how that looked, how you are handling that, and how you are including all stakeholders in that conversation?
Yeah, and I think this is another one of those emergent issues. I think we've just spent 2 or 3 years really thinking about like safety from the vantage point of COVID, right? How do we protect our staff? How do we protect our public? And I think before that, there was a much larger focus on active shooter training. And now we're in this moment where libraries across the country, Chicagoland, are getting these frequent bomb threats. I think last month we were getting probably 3 or 4 a week on average. And those could be to multiple sites. And I think we're in this new moment where our leadership has to be extremely responsive, communication-wise, and very collaborative and co-creative with our workforce, because our staff, we're in the social media world, they'll be seeing something on social media maybe minutes after it's gone out on a police scanner. And so I think the demand for responsiveness, the demand for clarity is really just gone to a new level. And so we've recently pulled together what we're calling our immediate response unit, and they're comprised of the president of our AFSCME union, the chief steward, because we really want to make sure that our processes, our communication, that we absolutely feel confident this is gonna serve our workforce. And I think that's a little bit different. Like we're bringing them into this table in a much more pronounced way, just because we can't afford not to have processes that work for our workforce. And I'm curious what Gene's dealing with over at DC. Hopefully less bomb threats.
Gene, do you have anything you'd like to share on that?
Well, I don't know about I have not heard of bomb threats, but
I'm so happy for you.
yes. I mean, I think we've had them in the past, and I'm sure, Washington, DC seems like a hot spot for that. So, but I think really what we're seeing here is, a level of street violence that comes into our buildings. I mean, it's a very porous space. Washington, D.C. is really a place where, like many cities, there has been an increase and spike in violence, particularly gun violence. And unfortunately, we have not seen that recede over the past 6 or so months, like a lot of cities. I feel grateful that we have not seen that kind of violence come into our buildings, although we recently did have a targeted stabbing in one of our buildings, and one of our patrons died on site, and that was devastating for everybody. And really, it's not something that could have been, like, our staff could not have prevented that. It was very targeted, but we are really looking at ways. We see everybody who works in our buildings part of violence prevention, part of keeping our libraries safe. We keep each other safe. I mean, that's something we talk a lot about. It feels like a lot for staff, but it is something I think is really important and can really empower staff to care for each other. I'm sort of that feel-good person, so I'm going to be very, but to care for each other and care about, and at the same time care about the patrons who come in, because I think that is really important to to this. And, you know, in the session I heard that happened last week, you know, we talked a lot about trauma. So helping our staff understand trauma of our customers, trauma, and how that impacts our staff, and then how we can all keep each other safe. And that is really, knowing all of that's happening, it's a lot, but we're working together.
Thank you on that, Jean, and thanks for bringing that up. So it's going to lead me to a question that I have for you. I know that the DC libraries have partnered with a dear friend of mine, a program that has been created under her leadership, Lauren Taylor, who has created a program specifically for libraries called Safe Libraries. And I know that it's been brought into the DC public libraries there. So do you want to share a little bit on what led you to this type of training, and what do you feel the impact has been for your library system?
Right. So we've worked with Lauren for about 5 years with the Safer Library training. I think she launched it here at DC Public Library. Together, we created something for our staff. I have to say, the reason I got Lauren involved is because I organized a training for my middle school age daughter and a bunch of her friends on how to be street smart and be safe. And I thought, you know, people, when I came here, staff really were articulating that, you know, there was a lot of things coming into the library and they didn't know what to do. And we have a police force here, our Office of Public Safety, folks who carry guns, but it really felt like the staff wanted more. They wanted to feel empowered so that they could kind of take care of themselves. And so I thought, well, this was a great training for my daughter and her friends. I thought, what the heck, let's see what we can do. And so together with Lauren, we came up with a training. It's a 4-hour training that really focuses on assertiveness, boundary setting, bystander intervention, and most importantly, de-escalation.
Great.
Yeah, and we offer that to staff ongoing. You know, folks have taken it many times over. It's never, you know, you're always learning something new. And I think it's really helped, especially around, it's helped us change the culture, I think, in the library around how, as I said, like, we're all responsible for safety in the library, how we think about caring for each other and our patrons. And I also think it has helped people engage more and feel like they can be more front and center with folks, and kind of take control of situations that they didn't feel like they could control before.
Great. Thank you, Jean. Thanks for that. Did you want to share anything on that, Commissioner Brown? I don't want to.
No, I think that's great what they're doing in DC. We do our de-escalation training and trauma-informed training, but I do think we're kind of missing that ongoing piece around like assertiveness. And you know, I do think when you look at data about the types of incidents we have, a lot of them are about either harassment of the public or harassment of staff or disruptive behavior. And so how you interpersonally intervene, I think, is so critical. So Jean, I'm learning from you here today as well. I'm going to flag that for us.
And that's funny, right? That one of the things that I really appreciate about Lauren and Defend Yourself and the Safe Library trainings is that they come, you know, they're taught by people who live in the community, and from a trauma-informed perspective, these folks are who do the training. It's one of their lead trainers is a social worker. So there's an understanding of kind of what happens in the library. It's not, I know there's in the public library world, there are definitely lots of folks who are doing different kinds of trainings like I can't remember what it's called. Anyway, verbal judo or things like that. Many things are taught by law enforcement. And I really felt it was important that we bring someone in who understands what happens in a library, not from a law enforcement perspective, but just from a customer perspective.
Yeah. Thank you, Jean. I'll share with you that in the Bay Area, we have a program set to start at the first of the year. And part of the thinking on this program came out of the summit last year, which is this has to be continued learning. This cannot be a one and done. What has been happening in many places is this kind of check the box, one and done type of training. So what we've developed with a library system in the Bay Area is continuous training. It's access to 40 hours of training, 35 to 40 hours of training, deeply scenario based, deeply built out of the incident reports that have come out of that library system. And I agree with you, Jean, it's incredibly important that those administering this training come from the community in which the libraries are serving. Hats off to you on what's happening with the DC libraries, and we're always very proud of the work that Lauren Taylor and her organization is doing. So my next question,
and just to kind of butt in on this one, I think it's something that library schools should start to think about a little bit more, like how is this skill set being introduced, and how are people joining the field with a little bit more awareness and just some scaffolding, so as they are developing these skills over time, they already have a little bit more context. I went through, and yeah, there was nothing about like, and I'm thinking back to my first major city library I worked for. We were across the street from a parole office. And so you just had constant folks that were coming in who were dealing with substance abuse issues or mental health issues. And yeah, it would have been great to have a little bit of context for what I was getting into.
Yeah. Thank you. That brings me to one of my next questions, Commissioner Brown, which is, a librarian and informational science degree. Does it really prepare you for everything that's happening in the libraries that you'll be working within? So how do we change that? Like I think you're starting to talk about during that program, during that degree, you're learning these skills as well. We believe that that's where it has to start. So we are pushing very hard for the creation of a center of excellence here at DePaul University that discusses violence in the workplace and how we go about that and how we start talking about it. As you're pursuing your degree, you're already hearing about it. You're already receiving training. Maybe you have a minor that goes along with your major degree on empowerment self-defense. So you have both those skill sets moving into the workplace. So we hear you. We're pushing hard to create programs and certifications like this, so it can accompany a degree like library and informational science. So if you guys can just touch a little bit on that, like how is that? I don't want to beat this line of study, beat it up, but it's not preparing those who are moving into the sector and into work positions properly. So can I have your opinion on that and what has to change?
Yeah, and I think you can see some of that tension in the field. I think it's an ongoing conversation about what's the right scale of libraries engaged in social work? You know, what's the degree to which we can contribute to this need? We know a lot of folks who are unhoused and who are seeking support on health access or food access or housing access. They're in our spaces, but I think to your point, you don't get a lot of kind of priming for that when you come into the field. And so there's that tension right now about what exactly should our role be. And I think what we struggle with is solutions that are more permanent. So we've done some pilots with Amita Health, bringing social workers in, and now we're doing this pilot with our public health department to bring mental health clinicians in. And I do think this tension and what's being brought up is right. Like, we need to have a more permanent resource plan if we're going to play that role in an ongoing way. And Jean, it sounds like you guys have more of that in place. So I'll pass it over to you.
So yeah, I mean, we, you know, there's, I mean, just in terms of violence prevention, we've also partnered with our violence interrupters through our Department of Youth and Rehabilitative Services to bring folks into some of our branches to help, you know, try to do some prevention. In terms of sort of how we can front load staff who are coming into public libraries. I mean, that is like the constant. I'm a librarian, I'm not a social worker. And so that's like the constant phrase. And I know that, well, I was started the Public Library Association Social Worker Task Force. This was pre-pandemic, and we talked a lot, the task force talked a lot about how schools of social work and library schools like that are in the same, like Simmons College, for example, like what program, what colleges and universities have library science programs and social work programs, and how can we create you know, some sort of department that works, or, you know, program that works across departments. And it seems like understanding, you know, violence intervention would be, and crisis intervention would be a really important piece to that. So, you know, that's something we talked about and how to make that happen. And I think some schools are, I'm not really sure.
Thank you, Jean. Yeah, that intersectionality on programs would be fantastic. You know, I'm going to jump on my paid prevention soapbox right now and just share that, you know, imagine if anyone who went into the hospitality or restaurant sector, you know, at that 16 starting job, you know, got 16 hours of learning how to set a boundary and learning how to use their voice and some de-escalation tools and some understanding about our own adrenalized body and how that may influence how we move through interactions. I mean, imagine what that would mean moving forward for that young person. If it just became part of the onboarding process for every job that we took. 16 hours, right? It'll be well worth it. I promise you. But that's my paid prevention soapbox.
And Arlene, I think what you're saying is an important point, and it's especially important in libraries, I think, because we don't get that training. I think the way that we respond is, I don't want to set that boundary, I'm calling the police, right? And I think there have been just working in libraries for so many years, we've had incidents where someone's, tried to steal library technology. And instead of having that like boundary setting, I think, moved to this law enforcement call. And I've known there have been instances in systems I've worked at where that law enforcement calls led to an arrest of someone with mental health issues. Sometimes that can really send someone into a whole other trajectory when maybe they just need a little bit more of that kind of boundary setting.
So that leads me to another question, a pivot. I'm going to pivot right here and ask. So we've had a lot of success in partnering with the macro responders in the Bay Area, in the city of Oakland. And they have almost become the go-to call for the libraries in the community before they call law enforcement. How is your interaction with law enforcement? And if you had an alternative, if you had or do you have a community responder program that you can kind of make that your first call rather than law enforcement or police? I'd love to hear about that.
So right, our Department of Behavioral Health in the District of Columbia does have a community response team, actually, which I engage with sort of often, have brought them in to do a training for our managers on how to use the community response team, so that if if someone, particularly around folks with severe and persistent mental illness, and because a lot of our customers are the same, they're consistently coming in, and if you're seeing someone who is not doing well, to maybe call the community response team, and because they might be looking for someone or can come out and talk to them. I think it's a matter here in the district of resources, and there just aren't enough staff with the community response team to come out to meet they're independent, and oftentimes if I call them or a staff member calls, they'll send you to the police. So it's a matter of resources here. I think what I'm trying to do is to create a better partnership with that team and with our Office of Public Safety. So our Office of Public Safety, and I will say this has been happening actually for the first time in 10 years. I feel like we are at a place where we're talking to our Office of Public Safety and thinking through about how we respond differently. And what crisis response looks like in our buildings. So, we're trying it both through working with our Department of Behavioral Health, and also internally, what do we need to do?
Great. Commissioner Brown?
Yeah, I think we're in a very similar boat. We have our kind of crisis response partners, but I think, to Jean's point, they also have a capacity. I think some of these programs are in their emergent stage, and so where they're deployed, what kind of resourcing they're going to need in order to play these roles, I think is still really being determined. Right now, I feel a lot of this falls on our library location leaders and our kind of like our system level managers to kind of flag, like, we might be dealing with a mental health issue. Let's maybe, we know that person's who that person is. We should maybe do an engagement with behavioral health as opposed to just calling law enforcement. And so I think it's in this judgment call stage where we're dealing with like capacity of our partners and what's what's our judgment call? So I think we're probably only like a few years into this, and how we operationalize this, I think, is yet to be determined.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. I will share with you that what's happening in that Bay Area and the influence and impact that the community responder program there is having is police are rolling up to situations and then stepping back and saying, I think this is a macro call, and which is incredible. So that's the type of impact that their community responder program is having in that area. So we're very proud of the partnership we have with them. We are their training partner through several of their academies. Yeah, it would be a nice trend if that were the first call we were making rather than law enforcement. So my next question is, and I think I'm going to start this with to Jean first. You touched upon it a little bit about being trauma informed. We think PAVE, we think it's incredibly important to create these trauma informed workplaces. I think it will allow people to reach their potential, to be the most productive, to be the most included, to feel the safest. So I think you have started the steps to creating a trauma informed workplace for your staff. And I think that in turn can flip those dominoes to creating a trauma-informed safe place for the people that come to your library, that are coming to your locations. So can you share a little bit about that? And then I'm going to go one more domino, right? We've created a trauma-informed workplace. We flipped the domino to create a trauma-informed safe place. And now I think that ripples into the community, creating a safer community. So please share a little bit about how you're feeling about that trauma-informed library.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about this here at DCPL, and I think actually libraries themselves are trauma and because we're a space where anybody can come and we're essential to the community. We're part of a trauma-informed community. You can change the lives of someone, particularly young people coming into the library.
Welcome. Hola, chica, ¿todo bien?
And
sorry about that. Someone needs to be muted.
That's okay. Through the Public Library Association Social Work Task Force, we created, a group of social workers created a workbook called A Trauma-Informed Framework for Supporting Patrons. And it's a real workbook with real scenarios. And our library manager, all the managers over the past year have been using this workbook, going through the scenarios, discussing them, and to help us be more trauma informed. That can mean, understanding, knowing where resources are in the community so that you can effectively refer someone who needs resources, having a little bit more understanding of mental illness and ways to respond to people. We're not asking our staff to diagnose anyone. That's not our job. That's not the job of frontline library staff, but to having a better awareness, how to talk to someone with an understanding around not what's wrong with you, but what has happened to you, and bringing that empathy to the conversation. So we, again, over the past year, all of our managers have gone through and together worked as a cohort through this workbook. And then next year, the managers are going to be working through some of this workbook with frontline staff. And just trying to begin to shift a little bit more about the way we're thinking about folks who are coming in, folks who have are living in severe poverty, the constant racism that people are living with on a daily basis. That is all affects people, you know, that's trauma, and they bring that into our spaces. So, and at the same time, we have then staff who also are dealing with their own trauma. So, you know, I think this process, this workbook will bring that out a little bit more and help us even get better at how we support both patrons and staff.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you. Commissioner Brown?
Yeah, I think this topic makes our customer service approach that much more important. You know, how do we create these supportive environments? And we're not just, you know, a place for people to go to have this transactional experience. We're a place that people are going to for their learning experience, right? So it's a little bit unique in that feeling safe, right? Feeling supported is so critical for any kind of learning experience. It's hard, I think, to expect people to come in and have that feeling of like curiosity and engagement if they're not really supported. So I think absolutely what Jean said about this trauma-informed training is critical. So many of our members of our public are going through, whether it's like neighborhood violence trauma or the migrant crisis. There are many different ways that people are having those experiences, but I do think beyond that, it makes our customer service work and the support we provide our public and our staff that much more critical. Like really figuring out how do we create an environment where people are actively feeling supported, your colleagues, your teams, as well as members of the public, that it's not just a municipal bureaucratic service, but we're looking for people to really feel that sense of like, you're an extremely important part of the mission of this institution.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. And you remind me again, you know, I know that we've all heard it and it's simple, but not easy, right? But when you look at our pyramid of necessity, our pyramid of needs, you know, after like air and water and shelter, safety is there. I mean, we can't learn if we don't feel safe. We can't thrive. I mean, everything comes from that feeling of feeling safe. So yeah, thank you for that reminder.
I think it's not also just the physical safety piece too. You know, I think like issues of like autonomy and status and like those are also really critical. I think psychological safety factors. Those are things that we're starting to think about and discuss as we're updating our customer service training, that there are these other more like cultural, psychological safety needs as well.
Okay, so, you know, I think we have to have the discussion about gender equity when we speak about like libraries and librarians, because you lead the way as a pink collar sector. So if you'd like to share any of these ideas that you have or thoughts that you have around being a pink collar sector and how libraries are leading the way for gender equality. Jean, would you like to start us?
No, I'm gonna let Chris take that.
Okay.
You know, I don't know if we actively sort of center that dynamic. I think there's probably a very interesting data way to look at this, right? The majority of our workforce are women. I don't know the exact breakdown of you know, data wise, who's more statistically likely to be homeless or suffering mental health issues. If there's like a gender element to that, I think just observationally working in libraries for close to 20 years, I see a lot of men in that role. And so I think that's a very interesting question that I don't think the field really tackled, but I think it's there just observationally when I look back to like, what are some of the most frequent workplace issues that we've seen around our public and the staff? A lot of time, what I've just seen anecdotally, it'll often be harassment of our female workforce. And so that's just, there's no data behind that, but just being in the field for 20 years, I've seen a lot of that. And so we do our part to make sure that we're really responsive to those threats. But I think from a training standpoint, there's probably more that we could be actively doing. It's a great question.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. Jean?
Yeah, that is a good question, because I don't think it's not something we talk about at the DC Public Library. I mean, certainly the majority of the workforce is female, especially the direct service folks. It's a highly female profession. But we don't talk about, I mean, I at least I'm not in those conversations. So, but it's worth considering. And I guess, bringing in a library safety training or safer libraries training is about, the women feeling like the women who work here feeling like they can have some agency over their situation. And I think that's really important.
Thank you, Jean. So we have a question that's come through the WUBA app. So I'll share it with you, and this will be kind of our last question before we head to our breakout rooms. And this one is, what impact has the evolving job description of a contemporary librarian had on your organization's recruitment and retention efforts? Are your workforces aging? And if so, have the prevailing work conditions impacted the well-being of your workforces?
I mean, I think this is something that the field struggles with. I think there's some really interesting work that's coming out of Cincinnati Hamilton County Library, where they're working with their local university to put together a program on how they can bring in a workforce that's not necessarily just library credentialed, but also some folks who are getting those classes on trauma-informed care, de-escalation training as part of their like on-ramp into the field, and who maybe just have like a public administrator's degree or a social worker's degree. And they're coming up with roles for them to play that are actually managing library branches, where as opposed to maybe like a more traditional setup where a social worker is leading the mental health component of the work. So I see there are some libraries who are kind of addressing these evolving needs with their job descriptions. We're looking at them and trying to have our internal discussions to move those models forward, but we're in fact finding mode ourselves.
Thank you. I know that we had touched upon the conversation based on our healthcare burnout conversation that we had last week, and you were like, yeah, it's something that we're dealing with as well. Jean?
Right. Yes, we also have had discussions here about bringing particularly managers into our libraries who do not have degrees in library science, but have more of a management background. And we've done a little bit of that. In fact, here at our main branch, we have the first floor of our main branch is a space with lots of computers and a cafe and lots of art exhibits, and kind of a new books section where people can grab a book and have a cup of coffee and things like that. It's very fluid. It's not stacks or anything like that. And we hired two social workers, for one to be the manager and one to be the assistant manager. And that's really been amazing, particularly our assistant manager, who on the first floor has a lot of experience in street outreach, working with people who are homeless, who are drug users, and has amazing skills at de-escalation and engagement with this population. And I feel like it has changed the way things operate on our first floor, and she's able to really engage with people, knows everybody's name, and it's been great, and we've had some not so great outcomes by bringing in people who are not librarians. I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag, and I think something that we'll continue to look at. And I think we've been updating our job descriptions and the way we interview people, with a real focus on, asking questions of candidates about, tell me a time when you had to de-escalate a situation in your, because we're always looking for people who have direct customer service experience. So we're trying to ask some of those questions to get folks who have some experience in this area.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for that question. So before we break into our breakout sessions, I would like to give you two prompting kind of topics. Please feel free to use them. Please feel free to ask Commissioner Brown and Jean your own questions if you have them. But two themes I'd like you to think about. One is, libraries are already a major contributor to culture change, and they are the fighters of democracy, the protectors of democracy as I see them. So with that said, how else can they influence public safety? And how else can they contribute to this conversation about public safety? And then the next kind of topic I'd like you to think about, I'm gonna share a quote. And it is in this process of reflection that we also ask, who are we overlooking? Who is not in our buildings? Who is being left out? And how can we bring them in? And that's our own Commissioner Brown's quote there from an article here in Chicago. So with that thought, looking through the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging lens, and already the great initiatives that the libraries are pushing on these topics, how does that influence violence prevention? Because I think diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging initiatives and arguments and presentations are huge in violence prevention. So if we could just think about those lenses as we move into our breakout rooms, that would be great. So we'll have about a little over 20 minutes, I think, in the breakout rooms. So before we move to the topics that I've kind of set out for us, does anyone have a question for Commissioner Brown that they'd like to ask directly to him during this breakout session?
I do, but I'll wait.
No, please go for it, Mandy.
Oh, just real quick, because Arlene mentioned think about who's being left out, and just back in the day, a library was a big deal to get your card and you show up to the library, it's quiet and you respect the librarian, you're kind of scared of her. And I feel kind of like the general public in a sense is being left out. Like as a mom, certain libraries, I wouldn't want to take my daughter. So my question to you is like, what would you say to like a mom like me who's kind of scared to bring my kid, and with the digital age now, we can just read at home. Why should we be going to the libraries when, you guys are dealing with all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think learning is so social. We learn so much in relationship. And I think it is really important for, I think, kids to have those connections to people who are helping them on their learning path, that are not just the parents, right? To know that this is a resource during your out of school time. And then also for parents, when we have our story time events, so many of those are about parents being together and getting those early literacy tips from our children's librarians on what to practice at home. And so many of those techniques are being modeled. And so I see it more from like a time to be with like a socialized group of other learners and parents, and for kids to see the library as a place to support their learning. So I think it's the social aspect that's important.
Absolutely, because the best memories were at the library. But like I said, it's completely changed from what I experienced.
I had like a very like grumpy librarian growing up. So
Yeah. Thank you.
You bet.
Does anyone else have any other
I think
questions?
Julie, did you have your hand up? Hey, Julie.
Where's my Julie?
Here, always technology right on top of it. My question is about funding and the case for libraries in Columbus, Ohio. We have a big system, then we have a suburban system. And it seems like there's competition for limited dollars. And how do we get more people to understand the function of libraries today, so that when the levies come up, if that's because we're funded by levies in Columbus, that they are not, they're more accepted, more understood. So it's really a funding. Yeah, and I'll be quiet now.
No, I and Columbus and Ohio, they are extremely well funded compared to libraries across the country. So they have about 40% of their budgets that come from the state. And your state has kind of had this funding package and tax for your libraries in Ohio for, I think it's well over a decade, probably 2 decades. So that's why when you look at like the libraries in the country that have the kind of top performance, looking at all their key performance indicators, there's always way more representation in Ohio. So I think you're already in a great spot. I do think being in Chicago, a lot of this does come down to local politics. So who's in that mayoral seat, who's in that county administrator role, and how do they view education, how do they view libraries, has drastic impacts on the fiscal health and the resourcing of our libraries. And to kind of bring it back to the security angle, that plays out in the resourcing of security, the resourcing of staff. Do you have enough personnel to make the spaces feel like there's always an adult in the room, and the spaces are being not monitored, but supported with people? So I do think the funding question has a huge impact on on the safety of our libraries. And one other point I'd want to share that I'm starting to think about, Arlene, even from this discussion, is we have contracted security. I know Jean mentioned they have DC Police Department that serve that role. In Chicago Public Library, we have these security contracts that provide, security presence. I think it's like 97% of our open days are covered, but it does make me wonder about over-policed neighborhoods, and are there models that we could start looking at that might deter our behavior disruptions by using more of like a social worker or a mental health clinician, as opposed to just immediately going to a security presence?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, Commissioner Brown, that you're thinking along this thought process, this thought line, because Chicago has just taken a really innovative step. The Chicago Public Schools have just taken a really innovative step with this new pilot called the Whole School Safety Approach, and they have moved $10.9 million out of school resource officers' budgets and put them into different initiatives within the high school system. And they're going to roll that into the middle schools and the other grade levels moving forward. But they've had incredible success with removing that school resource officer in many cases. Truancies, suspensions were down in the 86th percentile, expulsions were down in the 90th percentile. So they're having great success moving that feel of being over policed out of the school system. So any other questions for Commissioner Brown? Meg?
Hey, so I run a violence prevention and empowerment self-defense organization in Massachusetts, and we a few months back did some training for an LGBTQ group that had their drag story hour targeted by white supremacist hate groups. And it was an incredibly disruptive, scary, traumatizing event, to the point where some of their story hour readers just didn't want to read anymore. One of the struggles that they faced was sort of the other side of the fact that anyone was allowed in the library. And that is generally a really positive thing. And that's generally something that folks really love. But I think they really struggled because the people that were disrupting the event were not removed from the library because I guess they didn't disrupt the event enough. So they wound up moving their story hours out of the library and into a venue that they could control. So I wonder if that, especially with drag story hours and other types of events that are being targeted by hate groups, like how library leaders think about creating safer spaces and more inclusive spaces, even if it does mean asking people to leave.
Yeah, I mean, that's another one of these tensions that we were talking about, where this principle of like open for everyone welcome, this First Amendment right that we really kind of bolster and allows us to make sure that we have all voices in our collection, that we're not excluding BIPOC or LGBTQIA voices. That principle carried further and also allows groups like that to be in our spaces. We've not allowed them in our libraries if they're actively disrupting an event, right? So you can be there for the event. You can, be in our library while the event's happening. You just can't like harass the presenters. You can't stare at them or intimidate them. Like that's where we kind of draw the line. But I think to your point, it's caused us to have presenters or partners who don't want to necessarily be there in our space, or if they're feeling their safety is getting impacted. So as an example, we had a youth programming called Radical Fit, where we work with members and youth of our LGBTQIA community, some of them who work in the fashion industry. And this is a federally funded grant. We do this in partnership with the Chicago Parks District. And we were getting dragged by the group Gays Against Groomers on social media that if we went forward with this event, they would show up, they would protest, and it was a little bit of like a, you better cancel the event or else. And yeah, the presenter, they didn't feel safe. We have youth that are coming to these events to develop their fashion portfolio. These are just teens, and they and their parents don't feel safe. So we did end up moving the event to another location where I think the presenter felt a little bit safer. We work with our Chicago Police Department. But yeah, it is this like psychological terrorism that's going on where we are trying to do everything we can to support our audiences and presenters, but people can still go to the library, they can still stand outside, and they can protest outside, even if they're not disrupting the event indoors. We don't let them like block entrance and exit, but they could still be there protesting. So I don't think it's an elegant solution. I feel like we're in this mode of we're muddling along and trying to find the best solution in the moment.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. Thanks for the question, Meg. We have a question in the chat. Chris, I was struck earlier by your comment of the need for libraries to rebuild audiences. That sounds like you have lost patrons. If so, can you comment on your thinking to bring them back and the kind of safe space to accommodate them in the mix of new patrons? I'll also share, Chris, a reminder, if you could, Commissioner Brown, share with everyone that Chicago Public Libraries did stay open during COVID, and just kind of like how that, what came of that.
Yeah, and we were kind of like infamous for staying open in the field. It was not a popular decision. So when I was applying for this job, I came in February of 2021, and so we were already in the thick of the pandemic. There were not mass scale availability of vaccines yet, and Chicago Public Library was one of the largest library systems in the country that stayed open to the public. And there were articles in library press. There were articles in mainstream press in Chicago asking, why is Chicago Public Library staying open? Don't they care about their workforce? And so, I think it's not about the question in the chat, but I think it does get to our workforce engagement. I think that was incredibly hard for our 1,000 employees. The mayor at the time, Mayor Lightfoot, she felt very strongly that the access to our neighborhood libraries, to broadband, to making sure that students had access to our books and materials, to make sure that our unhoused had access to warming and cooling centers, that was a critical service. But I think it was a very hard time where people were being put in those first phases of vaccines, if you can think back to that. And library workers as a field were not in 1B, right, across the country. They were determined to be in, I think it was 1C. They were not in the essential workers category, even though we were open. So I think it was an incredibly difficult time for our workforce. And I think it's what's making these bomb threats even more difficult, because there's that narrative of like, is my employer looking out for me? What are we doing to protect our employees' safety? And so I think we're in a moment of a lot of trust rebuilding. I think that's why I mentioned earlier, we have like our chief union steward on this immediate response group, our union president, because we're in that trust rebuilding mode. And then I think with our audiences, yeah, if you think about, you know, Mandy mentioned being a mom and having her kids and going to the library. If you can think about those, you know, 2-year-olds to preschool, and they just spent maybe 2 or 3 years not being in our spaces or doing all that reading at home. I think the good thing is a lot of parents, what we're hearing anecdotally, is parents have spent a lot of time connecting with their children and their own learning that their children are going through. So I think that's like a great moment for parents, but I think we haven't built that audience. And so we're seeing about 60% of our pre-pandemic visitation, and that's pretty common across the library field countrywide. So as a field, I think we're really needing to rebuild those relationships and make sure that people have a habit of visiting their library. The same way that you like build a habit amongst youth going to museums through like their school trips. Like you have to build in that identity factor that these kids see themselves as a library user, as a reader. And I think we're missing about 40% of our users right now.
Okay, we are being prompted that we'll be moved to the main session. Anything, if you have any other questions, if you want to throw them in the chat, maybe we can get to them when we move to the main session after our wrap up of the breakout. Commissioner Brown, this has been great. Thank you.
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for everybody for joining. And I'm really excited about this discussion with libraries, because I think everybody in one way or another has been positively impacted by a library within their community, whether as a kid going for story time and, you know, learning how to check out their own books, to supporting community events that take place in the library. One of the topics that Arlene had just spoke about was libraries are already a contributor to culture change and a protector of democracy. How else can they influence public safety within their community? Jean, I have to start with you.
Okay, so this is everybody's participating here. Good.
Yes, everybody's going to have contribute to the conversation.
Oh, good.
Yes.
I think we can be models around public safety and how we, especially as government institutions, you know, how we engage with our customers and use our public safety, which we have here at the library. What is their role? I mean, this is a constant conversation here about the role of our public safety officers. It is not, you know, we have rules of behavior here. We have rules that people have to, you know, you can't right now, you can't sleep in the public library, although that may change. And is it the role of our public safety officers to wake people up? You know, so sort of thinking through about what is the role of public safety and how we can and models of how to utilize them in a way that is beneficial to the whole community, because oftentimes public safety is not beneficial to the entire community. They're there to make certain people feel safe. And so to have conversations about how they can make everybody feel safe. And yeah, I think we can be a role model in that, because I think we are having those real conversations.
Stephanie?
Good morning, everyone. Just to piggyback off of Jean, I certainly see libraries as being a role model, potentially, because you can create that safe space that is inclusive and accessible for almost the entire community. It's that community safe space that we really need to see everywhere. So.
Right. Cassandra, you were nodding. Did you want to contribute?
I was just agreeing that it is, and I think it's just so important that when you have an agenda like public safely, the organization that's promoting it or whatever, that it be all throughout your whole organization. You can't have not safety in the boardroom if you have this, or you can't say this if it's, if you're picking and choosing who you're waking up, any of that. And it's really, walking the walk. And I think so often so much is performative that to be able to see it being throughout how you deal with it. And I love the idea that I'm hearing you say, we're constantly looking at it, right? We're looking at it, we're updating it. It wasn't like we made policies and voila, we're there. That these are things that we have to revisit in order to stay up to date and to be in the world, which is changing quickly. And thank you for your work.
Here's a question. I'm totally in sync with what everybody's saying about modeling behavior, because I think it's a natural progression for a library as a center and resource within a community to also be the leader in modeling. What are some of the most effective ways that we can think of that would model behavior, would be a model for the community for safety? Does that make sense? Like, what would be the most impactful aspects of modeling for a library? Is it through a DEIB? Through compassionate response and care for the public? I'm just throwing ideas out there.
Well, I think it would be through compassionate care for the community. In public libraries, I don't know who is on here, but we have a whole process of barring people from the library if they, break one of our rules, etc. And that is, what my goal. And I know that there are some library systems around the country who probably track this a little better, but how do, looking at how interventions like, like a crisis responder or one of our, even with our social workers who are working on the first floor, how that might impact decreasing the number of bars that are given out. And oftentimes, and then if you are barred for a certain amount of time, you can't come back on the premises or you're arrested. So we are really looking at how to respond with compassion and care for people. I won't go too much into it, but we had an experience here that I think has really shifted the way we think about our response to crises. That we had a person who was in our library who was doing self-harm. It was a very horrific experience for everyone. The person was barred, even though they had been hurting themselves. They had a box cutter, and the person was barred. But we really worked with, but they were really struggling with mental health issues. And we worked with our public safety and ended up allowing this person to come back in the library. We worked with a whole clinical team in the community to try to get supports for them. So it's that, but that takes a real commitment.
Right.
But that kind of compassionate care can really change the way we think about how we can operate and do what we need to do. And it can happen, you know, so that's my take.
Thank you.
Jen,
Yeah, Steph.
can I jump in? Jean,
course.
I'm in the Bay Area, Stephanie's here, and I worked with the macro responders and training them. And that was fantastic to watch how compassionate care changed the community, started to change the response, because they were the macro responders coming out were looked at with suspicion. They were looked at, okay, first people mistakenly thought they were part of the police. Then they heard they were part of fire, and they still were looked at with suspicion. But just over time, just reaching out, are you okay? And letting folks know they're seen, they're heard, respecting them. It really changed the feel of the community. And I think it's very important, just listening today to yourself and the other speaker. It is so important that it's members of the community who come in and show that compassionate care. And I believe that makes all the difference. It seemed to, certainly with the macro responders in the Bay Area. So
Yeah. One thing that keeps coming up to me for me, and it was something that you had said, Jean, you know, about, you know, how librarians are very resistant to the idea that they're taking on responsibilities of a social worker within their position, because that's not what they went to school for. That's not what they got their degree for. All the research that I've read is saying the same thing. So how, for a librarian who's now faced with creating a safe environment that is looking at a community that in part does suffer from mental illness, that does come into the library as a resiliency center, a safe space, how is the librarian coping with not having that trauma transferred to them? And how do you prevent that type of fatigue that comes with the onslaught of constantly having to mitigate, you know, verbal harassment, all those situations that happen in a library, and also protecting yourself? I know it's a packed question.
Yeah, you know, we've actually, part of the library, safer library trainings we do are around self-care, and trying to help people take care of themselves. I mean, I think and again, I'm not in our human resources office, but I think having, you know, access to mental health care, easily accessible, you know, through your organization, I also think having leave policy, very strong managers who can help, who can model how to take care of yourself. I think that modeling is a huge and important piece. And I know that our managers struggle with that. You know, we oftentimes talk about how we don't have enough staff. People are on the desk a lot, which is, you know, the front facing work, and sort of how do we keep people from having hours on end of that front facing work so that they can get some time where they're doing other things, because it's a lot. One thing we have been talking a lot about is how we can incorporate a strong debriefing piece into when there are situations, when even small crises that are difficult to process, how we can build that debriefing into our when there are incidents. And you know, I think that's something we're going to be trying in this next fiscal year. We've done it a little bit. I know there are all kinds of different debriefing models out there. You know, and I'm really interested in something that kind of helps us think through how the incident happened over time and what we can learn from that. I think there are more trauma-informed debriefing, which is something I think is important, but I don't know that that's something that we have the capability here. But
right, understand.
Yeah.
You know, from a PAVE perspective, you know, we are very much in alignment with what you're saying in terms of identifying the domino effect of when that microaggression or those small incidents begin, and figuring out when we can, in that process, stop that domino at like 5 or 6 before it escalates into something that's very traumatic. For us, addressing self-care look as a check-in process and a check-out process with ourselves, with our partner, or with our team members. Even if it's just a simple incident of, you know, just a microaggression that got a little verbal, or if, you know, you have someone with mental illness and they're throwing books, and then now becomes a public safety hazard because now the public can be hit. So there's all these different things that we take into account when talking about librarians and them taking care of themselves. I mean, I know that Stephanie can attest to that because she does specialize in that with our trainings up in the Bay Area. But the check-in and check-out process, because it kind of gets them back to being grounded and rooted and separated from the anxiety that comes from the traumatic experience. Right. Oh, we have 2
Right.
minutes.
I can piggyback right off that and say once again, that was so important in macro and in general. I mean, we're talking, I just said, I see libraries as being a great safe space for community. You have to take care of your community within. And the check-in and check-out, showing that you're there for each other, you matter, everyone matters, everyone's valued. It was very big. It was transformative to watch, especially, well, anytime, even on that day that seems very, I don't know, no big major incident. And yet it's important, check in with your partner. It is building that community within your public library. If you wouldn't mind, Jean, may I ask you if you had, there had been a question about employing people at this point. I mean, you think librarian, you don't initially think you're responsible for this safety work or have the safety training. But if you had somebody come apply for a position who'd had training already in safety practices in the workplace, is that then more appealing? Is that something you look for in the future?
Well, I mean, I think it would be desirable to have someone who had that background already, just like bringing on this couple of staff members who are social workers, and how I think it could be really transformative, you know, if we had folks with that kind of experience. So, I mean, you know, we're always looking for people with customer service experience. That's the main driving force but, you know, having that additional having that additional training or that additional experience would be great. And a lot of our staff are not librarians. You know, we have another, you know, every library is different, but we have another level of a library associate, so someone who has to have a college degree, but doesn't have to have a master's level as a librarian.
Cassandra?
So my thought was kind of talking about that. It's just, it seems to me this modeling is just staying, some of this is just learning how to be a good human being. And the more we normalize this, that dealing with people, you shouldn't have to have a social work degree. We should be teaching this, and I'm not going to say, I'm preaching to the choir here, you know, in schools, like you know what Stephanie's saying, like if people know this, that we just have to learn how to be kind to each other, and it's not somebody else's job, you know, just compassion.
Well, thank you, everybody. I think we have to move over to the main room and share our report outs for these conversations. I can talk about this stuff all day long because it's fascinating to me. So thank you so much, and I'll see you in the other room.
Welcome back. Everybody is making it back into the main room. Jen, I don't know how it was for you, but our breakout session had tons of their own questions. So we didn't need any prompting questions in these breakout rooms. So I don't know how it went for you.
It
Please
went
share.
really well. We kind of rabbit hole down a couple of questions that we could have stayed for probably another 30 minutes if we wanted to. Mainly what we were talking about was, you know, how else can they influence public safety? And the main consensus was around modeling around public safety as a government institution, and what that would look like as compassionate care for the community, you know, through taking care of each other, taking care of the public. What does that look like? The other thing that we were talking about was the importance of actually listening and not being reactionary. So if there is somebody that does come in with an issue, it's actually really listening to what they have to say, really identifying where it's happening from. And lastly, it was also about looking at librarians coming into this field, not as a trained social worker, but having to take on those responsibilities of a social worker and how to prevent their own burnout. And what does that look like? You know, we were kind of touching on vicarious trauma, because, you know, it could be as simple as somebody just, you know, yelling in your face to somebody throwing books in the library and potentially hitting other patrons. We really distilled it down to, you know, self-care, and that self-care being modeled by management and leadership within the library branches, creating a check-in and check-out process, not only for oneself as a librarian, but also with each other and their coworkers, to help, you know, mitigate anxiety and to kind of get grounded and back in reality so you can continue working. So that's kind of where we were in those two spheres.
Great. Thank you, Jen. We had some great questions. One of them was along the lines of, you know, what is the importance of including more people in the library, and how do you do that? Why is it important to go back, since we can Google something and gather information, and why is it important to go to the libraries? Commissioner Brown shared that he really felt it's the social interaction that comes from coming to libraries, and it's the exposure and interaction with other people. There was a funding question on how libraries are pressured under funding constraints, and why it was important to, well, Commissioner Brown shared that, you know, a lot of it is incumbent upon leadership at the time, who's leading the libraries, who's leading the cities. But yes, those are always issues. We also discussed Chicago Public Schools whole school safety approach, which is now doing away with some school resource officers and allocating those funds to something else. And Commissioner Brown shared that it was a question of, you know, are we over security? Are we having too much security in libraries? Are we having too much policing? Is it a discussion that we need to communicate and talk about. It's definitely on his mind. And then how do we deal with targeted hate groups disrupting programming in the libraries? You know, Commissioner Brown refers to this as psychological terrorism. And they do their best to maneuver around it and create a safe space, but still give everyone access to the libraries as they move forward. And then earlier in the conversation, Commissioner Brown shared that he was trying to rebuild his audience, that the Chicago Public Libraries were trying to rebuild their audience. And he said, yeah, you know, post-COVID, it's recreating, you know, creating new habits for people again, who may not have had that kind of exposure to libraries organically like they would have had COVID not hit. So that he shared that 60% libraries were down with attendance about 60% across the board. He was feeling that that was what's happening nationwide. So rebuilding.
We're down 40%.
40%. Sorry, so you're at 60%.
Our pre-pandemic numbers. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. We just have a few minutes before we have to close up. I hope, you know, my team and I, we were brainstorming on what we really wanted out of this session. And what we really wanted out of this session is for people who are not having these conversations, as PAVE is having these conversations within the library sector, but people who aren't really start thinking about what is happening in our libraries and what are they dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and start thinking about it and having more conversations about it and being more supportive, because I know it sounds, you know, nutty, but I do believe this is like where our democracy lands, in these libraries. This is where it's protected. So I hope that this session is at least conjuring up a little thought. I hope that it has maybe encouraged you to look into it, to visit a library, to look into your libraries and make sure that your communities are keeping them safe and protecting them. And once again, I think this is a great opportunity for us to hear from a sector that we may not have been exposed to and understand the challenges around violence prevention and safety and public safety that they are dealing with. What's working for them, what's might not be working, what are their challenges, and then looking at it through our sector's lens, whether that be healthcare, hospitality, emergency preparedness, schools, educators, and see where can we connect, where can we combine our efforts. So super excited again. I've been so pumped from our session so far within the PAVE Summit. I hope that you all can join us for Thursday's session, where we are dealing. Jen, I'm going to put you on the spot. Sorry. Could you please share the topic for Thursday's, the official topic
Sure,
for Thursday's session?
Sure, our official topic. Redefining accountability through moral imagination. The need for a collaborative approach to violence prevention in both public agencies and within private sectors.
Great.
It's a
Thank
meaty
you.
one. Yes.
Thank you for that reminder on that one. Yeah. So we'll have Carolyn Richmond, who is one of the leading hospitality attorneys in the country, if not the world. We'll have Dr. Kelly. And our last panelist on there is Ty Scheiber, who is comes from the School of Leadership at Virginia Tech. So a great panel. In the chat, thank you, Federica, for the reminder, is a little questionnaire, a post session questionnaire. We would love your feedback. Thank you all for joining us today, but a special thank you, Commissioner Brown and Jean from DC Public Libraries. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing with us the great work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all.
All right. Have a wonderful day. Thank you, everyone.